if it turned out that our own intelligence services were involved in or allowed purposefully the assassination of our own president, that would have, I think, implications diplomatically for U.S. standing abroad. So this is really one of the first litmus tests about how serious the Trump administration is about cleaning up the agencies.
So what's the real story of Jeffrey Epstein?
Where I am on it currently is it does seem like Epstein was an access agent. There's a question of how much smoke do you need to have before you just come out and say, there's a dang fire.
Mike, welcome to TRIGGERnometry.
Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you on. We are sitting here on the day that allegedly the JFK files are going to be released. Yeah. Do we know what's in them?
We don't. There could be bombshells. It could be a nothing burger. There could be bombshells that are redacted. I know that the president has come out and said that he's going to try to prevent any redactions from, when Pam Bondi declared that they were going to come out a while ago, she said subject to, redactions about national security concerns around the Epstein, I guess this was around the Epstein disclosures, and that prompted this sort of public backlash. What could undermine U.S. national security about what's in the Epstein documents? And I think there's a similar perception about the JFK assassination, that there are implications for national security and for American standing if it does turn out that there was malfeasance or foreknowledge coming from the national security state. So there's a lot of very strange evidence around the role of our own intelligence services in the death of JFK. This great book called JFK and the Unspeakable, which documents much of this. The CIA was opening the mail, for example, of Lee Harvey Oswald for months before the assassination, suspecting formally that he was a counterintelligence probe, basically, that he might be working for Russia. And so they were basically monitoring his communications and mail beforehand. You have a number of other strange circumstances around the events that happened that day. And if it did turn out, for example, that there was a role of our own intelligence services in that assassination, you could imagine the diplomatic backlash that would have for our own State Department, right? When we go around and we accuse the FSB or something in Russia, or Chinese intelligence services or Iranian intelligence services of malfeasance or human rights violations. If it turned out that our own intelligence services were involved in or allowed purposefully the assassination of our own president, especially one whose name lives on in, the Kennedy family is still a significant part of the Democrat Party. You have Bobby Kennedy, who is the current head of HHS. This is not ancient history. This is a family name that lives on. That would have, I think, implications diplomatically for U.S. standing abroad. And I could see there being a knife fight within the national security community about trying to redact the most damning evidence. And so this is really one of the first litmus tests about how serious the Trump administration is about cleaning up the agencies in terms of transparency for past malfeasance. When it's easy to go after things like Crossfire Hurricane or times when Trump himself was personally attacked. But they've been serious about cleaning up the personnel side. They're in the process of firing or offering golden handcuffs to the CIA. They've decimated the staff at USAID. So I think they mean business, but it's a question about whether or not they can get it done.
Well, one of the guests we've had on the show before is Michael Francis, who's a former New York mobster, basically. And he told us, I think it was in the Substack section, the paywall section, that the Mafia were involved somehow.
A lot of time people were attracted to us, politically also. Hey, listen, when the CIA came to us, fact, okay, to help them assassinate Castro, the CIA came to us 100% with JFK's assassination. I heard that my entire life from people that were in the know. And normally in that life, if you had something to do with murder, you don't want to talk about it, okay? But I heard enough about the Kennedy thing to know what went on there.
Wait, are you saying the mob murdered JFK?
I'm saying they were complicit in it, yes. And I'm telling you this, I've heard that all my life from the right people. And I'm telling you this, there are classified documents that the United States is holding that every 25 years is supposed to release them. Trump was going to release them, then they put the brakes on it. Because I believe those classified documents are going to show that the mob was complicit in that. And the U.S. government does not want the world to know that a sitting president was assassinated with the help of the mob.
Are you expecting that to be part of this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, there's always an overworld, underworld connection to these things, whether that's in assassinations or whether that's in smuggling narcotics or smuggling goods or arms. This actually gets to the Epstein network as well. I mean, you have these, Jeffrey Epstein was, I mean, it's interesting how these things line up and how they're both coming to a head simultaneously with these attempted disclosures, because the Kennedy assassination was in '63. The Epstein story really goes back to the 1980s, not too long after the JFK assassination and aftermath, and they both involve this overworld underworld connection. You had the Teamsters that were alleged to have had a role in it. You had the fight with the unions. The unions play a really interesting role in statecraft because they serve as rent-a-riot muscle when we're trying to destabilize a country, when we're doing color revolution work to try to mobilize a wellspring within a country to unseat its government. The first thing we do is we go to the trade labor groups, the unions, the workers' movements in the country, and then we try to destabilize the industry from within. We cause mass walkouts. We, have people, instead of making sure the trains run on time, they're walking out of the hospitals. They're walking out of the state-run media organizations. They're walking out of, daycare. They're blocking the highways. And that brings the instruments of a dictator to a halt, as we sort of put it. They can't weaponize their own power arm because there's nobody, there's nobody to basically man those stations of power. And oftentimes, these are rough and tumble types who will take to the streets, especially if they're getting money on the side from a USAID or a National Endowment for Democracy or a State Department. So why we have the National Endowment for Democracy has a specific center called the Solidarity Center, which NED is effectively a CIA front. It was conceived in the office of the Central Intelligence Agency Director, William Casey, in 1983. It was sort of replacing the old CIA function after the CIA got in trouble in the 1970s during the Church Committee hearings. And they have an arm called the Solidarity Center, which goes out around the world and works with the unions. And the unions are very close to the organized crime nexus. I mean, this is something that is not just a sort of Hollywood theme or like a Sopranos style theme where you have, the unions and the mafia, but this goes back a very long time because you have these rough and tumble types who will, do dirty deeds done dirt cheap. They are often at the exact nexus of the logistics chain for intelligence work. So, for example, if we are running arms to rebels in Nicaragua, as we were doing during the Iran-Contra scandal, you're going to need those arms shipped from ports in Miami or Tampa or New Orleans. You're going to need the dock workers who are on board. The dock workers, the shipping magnates, the whole logistics chain is going to have to run through the people at the docks who are putting the cargo in and who are not looking or not reporting, what's inside them. And that's simultaneously an organized crime type activity when you're talking about the sale or movement of narcotics or illegal arms. This is something that Epstein himself was involved with to sort of connect this Epstein-JFK world, in the sense that Jeffrey Epstein, his whole network was involved in Iran-Contra in the early 1980s. It was Jeffrey Epstein who helped move Southern Air Transport, which was a CIA proprietary airline from Miami to Columbus, Ohio, which is where Les Wexner was. That was his main backer. So he basically had a CIA airline that was implicated in illegal drugs and gun running in the 1980s, moved directly to Columbus, Ohio, exactly where Epstein had bought property, and Les Wexner, his principal sponsor, who he had power of attorney over his whole financial empire. That was to me. You have this. What's most interesting about it is when the organized crime activity is actually sanctioned by the intelligence state, and that's where I think you get into the dirty laundry that the Trump administration is going to have to think long and hard about the degree to which you want to expose, because it's not just us in the U.S. who see these disclosures. It's everybody else. And then suddenly these things get held up at the United Nations. These things are persuasive to neutrals like in India or a European country who might be caught between worlds. Like you can very easily see neutrals being persuaded to think, okay, well, if they were backing the organized crime networks here, and in this case, and we know that there are these unions who are getting these USAID grants or who are meeting with the U.S. Embassy here, and they're causing us a hard time, it could cause a crackdown on a lot of the soft power influence nodes that we still have in existence today.
Well, you mentioned Epstein, and that's something that I really want to talk with you about, because I haven't looked into it deeply at all. I don't really know much about it. The Joe public perception of this, I would say, is there was some rich guy who hobnobbed with all these famous people, some of them powerful people, and he was into young girls, and some of these people were into young girls, so he brought them to his island, and they all had a good time, basically, right? So what's the real story of Jeffrey Epstein?
Well, no one really knows. It's a black box. There's so many potentials for what it could be.
Who was he, first of all? Just tell us his story.
Yeah, well, he's a guy who was linked at a young age to our own former head of the Justice Department when he, suicided himself effectively. I mean, I don't know how many people to this day believe it was genuinely a suicide, but the fact is he came up through he was the official story is he was working in finance at Bear Stearns. He develops a close relationship with Leslie Wexner, who was the head of Limited Brands, which was the largest retailer in the country in the 1980s. He was given power of attorney over Les Wexner's entire financial empire, was basically given, penthouses for $1, and was completely hooked up to this, powerful retail magnate, and was involved in bundling money for the Clinton administration during the 1990s. As I mentioned, he was involved in basically personally negotiating the transfer of a CI proprietary airline directly to his sponsor's home city. That airliner then would carry the goods of Limited Brands to and from Hong Kong. And then you had Epstein get in trouble with these criminal indictment charges around underage girls in the in the late 90s. Then you had Alex Acosta, who was the federal prosecutor that was in charge of the Epstein case, being questioned in 2017 about why he gave basically a wrist slap to Epstein after his second indictment then. And he really ignited this in a big way when he said the reason that he did not pursue various charges or try to throw the book at Epstein was because he was, quote, told to back off because Epstein belongs to intelligence. And that produced, a huge curiosity, because Epstein, going back decades, had been accused variously of working for the CIA, of working for Israeli intelligence, of having connections to British intelligence. And, I think there's a great quote that was in, I think, the New Yorker magazine in the mid-1990s. And it went something like, no one knows if Jeffrey Epstein is an insurance broker, a concert pianist, a CIA agent, a retail magnate associate, or a Mossad agent. And there is something. John Kiriakou, who's a former CIA agent, I think put it the most where I am on it currently is it does seem like Epstein was an access agent. And it's unclear whether...
Sorry, can I just stop you there? What does an access agent mean? A man's grooming routine says a lot about him. It's not just about looking good. It's about confidence, self-respect, and standards. Now, I obviously have all of those things in abundance, and that's why I use Manscaped. Their full-power shave portfolio is engineered for precision and performance. The Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra keeps things smooth where it matters. The Chairman Plus delivers a barbershop-quality shave. The Beard Hedger ensures a sharp, sculpted look. And the Handyman is perfect for quick touch-ups on the go. And if you're embracing the clean-shaven look, the Dome Shaver Plus guarantees a flawless finish. There's no reason to settle for second-rate tools when the best are within reach. Elevate your grooming routine today. Go to manscaped.com and use code TRIGGER20 for 20% off plus free shipping. Or find Manscaped at a store near you. Manscaped. Trim your chesticles with the besticles. I don't know why they asked me to say that. What does an access agent mean?
Someone who gets access to high-level political figures, cultural figures who can swing hearts and minds, business figures. You know, if I came to you and I said, I'm Mike Benz, I work for the CIA, tell me all your secrets. You're not going to do that. But if you think that I'm, a fun-loving guy who's got access to beautiful women and I throw great parties and I can take you and your friends on a great vacation and we've got common business interests, and I will learn things in the process of those conversations that I can then relay to folks in the intelligence world who simply want to know what the next move is of these political figures or of these billionaire investors or funders. It's also a way to broker deals in a way where you effectively have a back channel. Oftentimes these high-level business deals between nation states and also between nation states and corporations need a little bit of massaging from back channels, from interlocutors, from go-betweens who don't formally represent that foreign government or that government. Like the State Department, great example of this is Bill Burns, who was the CIA director for Joe Biden, for President Biden for all 4 years. He was picked to be the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, having never worked for the CIA. He had spent 35 years in the State Department. He negotiated the Iran deal for President Obama, and then he went to work at a think tank for 7 years. And then how does someone like Bill Burns know how all the gadgets work? How does he know how to work the cockpit of the CIA, having never worked there? And the answer is because when he worked for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which he was the president of for 7 years before he got the CIA job, that's one of those think tanks that's at the center of this back channel statecraft. In fact, his own autobiography is called The Back Channel, and it basically details his role and the role of his network in being able to massage deals in the background, like the Iran deal. If you're going to line up something like the Iran deal, which was this early 2015, pivotal moment that created this big rift between Israel and NATO, it created this big rift between the Obama foreign policy world and much of the bipartisan buy-in that existed between the certain factions within the GOP. I think that really cleared the way for Trump. But to line that up, you're going to need all the different stakeholders aligned. And sometimes you can't send in a formal U.S. State Department person to do that. You might want to convey a more heavy-handed message that you don't want to be on the record conveying. But if a back channel conveys it, then you can deny it later. Same thing. So whether that's brokering deals, whether that's setting up informal networks, this is a big part of how statecraft operates. You have these formal bureaus and these formal divisions and formal W-2 employees at state or CIA. But most of the work happens at the informal layer where someone from state or someone from the intelligence world who is who's basically a symphony orchestra conductor of these outside groups that are informal and that can massage it, can get a general sort of set of terms lined up, who can convey sanctions are going to be forthcoming or whatever the message is, and also who can gather intelligence that can be used that you can't necessarily get if you are in the intel world and you don't know who's all going to be there. You can't necessarily tap all their phones, or maybe they just bought a burner phone. You need a fly on the wall. You need someone in the room. And I think that is probably the closest to the Epstein story. And I don't know which government it is. It could be, there's obviously a U.S. government connection in the sense that an American prosecutor was told not to go through with prosecution because he belonged to intelligence. So you obviously have at least the U.S. government involved in that. And again, when you date it back to this whole Iran-Contra network, that was a U.S. government activity. And this was this whole Adnan Khashoggi network that Wexner and Epstein ran through, that they were involved in the illegal arms sales to Iran, to evade sanctions by back-channeling the whole thing. And then the guy goes on to negotiate the sale of a CIA proprietary airline. There's obviously U.S. statecraft. There could also be British statecraft involved. There could also be Israeli statecraft involved. These things often move together and have for a century. And so I hear a lot about the blackmail story, though, with Epstein, and that's where I'd like to see more evidence. This is sort of
well, the reason people say that is it's kind of the obvious thing. Like, if you get a pedophile to bring other people to his pedophile island, that's the perfect place for blackmail material to be generated, isn't it?
You would think, but there's also, there's weird examples of this happening without blackmail. There was a case in the early 2000s with a private military contractor called DynCorp. And DynCorp was implicated, and they were actually banned from being able to get government contracts for a certain time after that, because they were supplying young girls to these Arab sheikhs and to these sort of paramilitary leaders in Central Asia and Middle East, North Africa. And, this was like human trafficking. These are young girls that were basically given, as a way of juicing deals and as a way of, sort of making their clients happy. But that didn't necessarily involve, there wasn't a blackmail, situation.
It was a service
going on
provided,
there. Yeah,
basically.
right.
Yeah.
And so, what I feel like it's presupposed that it's a blackmail ring, and I would think with the thousands of people that Epstein had as clients or was constantly interfacing with, that one person would come out and say, yes, Epstein or an Epstein associate directly tried to blackmail me with, potentially incriminating, evidence from a video camera. I mean, someone could, with the thousands of people who were implicated in these Lolita Express, Little St. James Island trips, you would think that now you might say, okay, well, no one wants to come forward because they don't want to reveal that they had been blackmailed. But, people can be down on their luck and have little to lose and much to gain. I mean, frankly, you don't even need to say what was necessarily on it. You can imagine the multi-million-dollar book deal you get by claiming that you are the victim of this, of this extortion. And the fact that not a single person, to my knowledge, has come out and said that is, it doesn't sit well with me that it should just be presupposed in that way. If you look at, for example, Epstein's relationship with people like Ehud Barak, who was, the former prime minister of Israel, was constantly at Jeffrey Epstein's penthouse. Ehud Barak was working closely with the West Exec, which was the main sort of foreign policy, national security, intelligence incubator hub for the Biden White House. That was where Jake Sullivan and all of these other national security experts were, and they were consulting with Ehud Barak, and Ehud Barak was tightly aligned with them on foreign policy against Trump world things. I suspect that Epstein was sort of synthesizing in the network. Same thing with Reid Hoffman. I know that there's Elon currently has a feud with Reid Hoffman, who's sponsored a number of these anti-Trump, anti-Elon groups. Billionaire, highly influential in Democrat politics. I'm not convinced that Hoffman was being blackmailed by Epstein so much as you're trying to gather intelligence on them. And the other thing is if somebody in the network squeals to a friend because they're being pressured or extorted, hey, Epstein's trying to blackmail me. Well, that makes Epstein useless because that word gets around there. If I'm being blackmailed, I might tell my mom and dad, I might tell my best friend, they're trying to blackmail me. I don't even need to say what I'm being blackmailed for. That immediately creates a pressure valve on the person, and that word gets around, and then they say, okay, I don't want to hang around with this guy because there are rumors that he's blackmailing this other person. And then there goes all the access. There goes, your access to Bill Gates and Reid Hoffman and heads of state all over the world. So I think there's layers to it, if that makes sense.
No, of course there's layers to it. The thing that I can't believe is that you have a man who is a convicted paedophile and the US still wants to have involvement with him. Surely wouldn't they look at that and go, this guy is a complete liability? And then also the people who spent time with him. I mean, if I was a public figure of that repute and of that notoriety, the last thing I'd want to do is hang around with a convicted paedophile. That's just a surefire way to torpedo your reputation, isn't it?
It's tough. I mean, on the first question about why the U.S. would continue to have dealings with Epstein after the first indictments came down, these networks are always very, very messy. When you're talking about this sort of back channel intelligence work, when you're talking about moving illegal arms or narcotics or working in shady conflict zones and things like this, it tends to attract a cowboy type who is singularly capable of doing things that a more straight-laced person with a clean record can't really pull off. I mean, a great example of this is Hunter Biden. Hunter Biden has gotten in a lot of trouble throughout his life. He was kicked out of the Navy for cocaine. I don't know what possessed him to do this particular part, but he was recording on his own laptop him snorting lines of cocaine while, sleeping with Russian prostitutes and, negotiating what girls to bring over and pay for, carrying around unlicensed firearms. I mean, the litany of, he didn't pay his taxes for 5 whole years in a row. And yet he was on the chairman's advisory board of the NDI. The NDI is the National Democratic Institute. It's the DNC branch of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a literal CIA cutout. Again, it was conceived by the CIA in 1983 because they were sad that they had lost their powers after the Church Committee hearings in the late 1970s. The founder of the National Endowment for Democracy said it was terrible in the 1960s and 70s when the CIA was seen as subsidizing political dissident groups. That's why the endowment was created, so that we could provide the funding and it wouldn't look like the CIA was going to do it. The CIA gets a copy of every grant that the National Endowment for Democracy makes. They have 2 political branches, the IRI, the International Republican Institute for Republicans, and the NDI, the National Democratic Institute for Democrats. And Hunter Biden was on the chairman's advisory board after that stuff. And also the NDI was run by Madeleine Albright, who was the Secretary of State under Bill Clinton. But Hunter Biden is also being tasked with, effectively conducting a form of covert corporate espionage and statecraft while he's at Burisma. They were pitching Burisma to the State Department as being a way to hedge Europe off of Russian gas by building up Ukraine's endogenous gas supply. And working directly with the State Department in a number of regions, they petitioned the the government of Italy to get them deals. They petitioned the State Department in Foggy Bottom to juice the skids in Ukraine. You had Joe Biden personally go to Ukraine and threaten withholding $1 billion USAID loan guarantee to remove the prosecutor who was investigating this. But the question is, well, why would you task Hunter Biden to do that? There's a bunch of Bidens. You had James Biden. You had the nieces, the nephews, or you could just have a friend. But why was it Hunter? And part of this is these personality types. First of all, you're also dealing in a lot of these cases with organized crime networks, where crime is not a disqualifier to daily life, especially if you're in a place where you control the prosecutors and you're not going to get arrested for various things, whether that's drugs or prostitution or guns or deals that evade sanctions. And so it is dirty work. And so often that requires dirty people to do it. And someone walking in with a totally clean record and no rap sheet is often a stick in the mud, or can't speak the lingo, or can't hang. And you accrue that over years, and they have no access. They have no credibility. So, it's just like in the role of organized crime when it comes to the JFK story and with the Epstein story, with the Hunter Biden story, and that same thing with Iran-Contra. Barry Seal was the guy who was the cocaine cowboy who was flying the drugs in and out of Nicaragua when we were using those drugs to convert to cash to buy the guns to get around the congressional blockade on using U.S. taxpayer funds to do it. But why did you pick this cocaine cowboy to be the one, flying? Well, because he was an ace pilot. He could speak the lingo with the locals. He knew the people on the ground. They trusted him. And so he's the way you get access. I mean, you see this story not infrequently in movies, and I think not for a wrong reason.
It's interesting that you say that, and I love the fact that you brought up the idea of a movie, because sometimes when talking about Jeffrey Epstein and people who have met him, they say that he's almost not a real person. He was like a construct, which I find really interesting. So what do people mean by that?
Well, I think it gets back to the fact that no one could quite make out who he really was. I come back to that quote from like the New Yorker or whatever it was, where they said no one can tell if he's a real estate broker, a CIA agent, a concert pianist, or a Mossad. You have a guy who's got a very, very strange backstory getting into this ridiculous position of power and privilege. Someone who was only on Wall Street for a couple of years before he basically inherits this massive portfolio and is able to, get access to, like, I come back to if I tried to negotiate the sale of a CIA proprietary airline, as a regular civilian, would make no sense. How do you even get the access? How do you even get in position to do that? But, there was a very strange backstory even to that, because you had this, this Iran-Contra situation in the early 80s. And then you had this network in Columbus, Ohio that was under investigation. And then the main attorney representing that Columbus network, this guy, Arthur Shapiro, everyone can look up this mysterious 1985 assassination of Arthur Shapiro, which was in the middle of this Iran-Contra scandal. He was the guy who was handling he represented the law firm that was handling the accounts for this Ohio network. He had not filed taxes for something like 7 years. It's another one of these Hunter Biden type situations. So he was under the gun of an IRS investigation. He was murdered the day before he was set to testify to the grand jury in the IRS case. And it was a very strange situation, because when you look at that network's role in Iran-Contra and in these sort of illegal organized crime networks, you could see how somebody might be assassinated because, especially because the tax records provide this, hard forensic evidence of what you did with the money. And if his testimony to clear his own name required implicating the people in that network, you can see why he may have been killed for the same reason that someone like Jeffrey Epstein may have been killed 30 years later. And what's very interesting about that is Epstein met Wexner that very same year in 1985. And there's a lot of speculation that Epstein effectively took the place of that law firm, in terms of handling that Columbus, Ohio network account and taking care of the financial transactions and having it not be formally, accountable to that network. And in fact, that would explain the power of attorney. That would explain, these huge assets that were given over to Epstein for apparently nothing in return. And the fact that network is involved in U.S. statecraft, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but also in the Middle East, both, in terms of Iran, Israel, the strange sort of, Arab Sheikh, relationships with all that. I also find it very strange that Jeffrey Epstein was able to lease an apartment in New York City directly from the U.S. State Department. It was a very curious episode. I believe this was in the 1990s. But Jeffrey Epstein was able to get a lease directly from the U.S. State Department for one of his properties. I don't know how I would go about having the State Department as my personal landlord.
Yeah, and when we talk about this, Mike, because we all have a conspiratorial element to us, and I'll be honest with you, you Americans, you love a conspiracy theory. It's your national sport. You chat about a few things and then you go, right, who's really in charge?
Well, when you have a First Amendment, it makes it a lot easier.
Touche.
Yeah.
He fired back at you right there, mate.
Yeah.
No, but I think culturally, we just had Andrew Schultz on, we were talking about this as well. This may go out before that one, but I think part of the amazing thing that makes America so wonderful is the sense that it's like filled with people who think anything's possible. And that's why you can achieve great things and do amazing things. But if anything's possible, anything is possible. And I think just culturally, we spend a lot of time here, but we're not from here. We notice that it's a very popular thing in America in a way that it isn't in other places.
Well, it's interesting. I would think that people in the UK would be, given, that perfidious Albion moniker for British statecraft and, the role of covert British intelligence work in so many world events and for so many centuries now. I would think that people would be a bit more curious in the UK to try to get answers to various things. In fact, our own intelligence
but we're the good guys.
Right. Well, but this is what's funny is I think that a lot of what's happened in the past 10 years has been because of the perception, which I think is the correct perception, that these intelligence agencies and covert action powers have been weaponized against our own people. And that has, it was Republicans who were leading the charge about the Iraq War, about the war on terror, about, the use of the CIA to do drone strikes. It was John McCain who, led, many of these regime change operations, who ran for president in 2008. The Bush family was basically born of the CIA, from Prescott Bush to George H.W. Bush, who was the CIA director. To this day, the main CIA headquarters in Langley is called the George Bush National Intelligence Center. But when it was weaponized against our own people, and so transparently, the CIA coming out with that memo saying that the 2016 election was basically illegitimate because of Russian bots and trolls, and then we saw our own FBI counterintelligence, take up the mantle of this. And I think that has created the perception of urgency in getting answers to things that we had long taken for granted. But the other thing I'll say is this: if you don't want conspiracy theories, then you can't have conspiracy agencies. Mm-hmm. The fact is everything that the CIA does is cloaked under something called NSC 10-2. It's the National Security Council memo 10-2 in 1948 that made gave them the cloak of plausible deniability, that basically they could deny what they're doing, and as long as they didn't, as long as the U.S. government, the U.S. State Department could plausibly deny what had been done, then it was sanctioned. Everything was sanctioned: espionage, arson, black propaganda, economic sabotage. Up until the 1960s and 70s, even assassination was allowed to be done if it was covert. And so you have this situation where it's one thing if that's just the dirty work being done in a conflict zone when you're dealing with terrorists or a bona fide dictator, and it's all outside the house. But because these things have power, they have tentacles into everything, and it makes a lot of sense as to why that is. To me, I don't even talk about this. I don't even think I really come into it with a very conspiratorial tone. This is just business. This is just how it's done. If the intelligence world is not the final boss of this by any stretch. The CIA director makes about $220,000 a year. That is less than like a second-year associate at a New York law firm. You could be correcting typos, as a glorified paralegal your second year, and you're making more than the head of the Central Intelligence Agency.
Well, there's kids on YouTube unboxing toys that make 10 times that.
Right, yeah, at 14. And so, and not only that, the CIA occupies a very junior position within the whole national security state structure. It's well below the National Security Council level. It's well below the State Department level. This is why it's always a promotion to go from CIA director to Secretary of State, like Mike Pompeo was promoted from CIA director to state, or Leon Panetta for the Democrat CIA director under Bill Clinton got promoted to the head of the Defense Department, because the intelligence only plays a junior role to statecraft work or to military work. It's just an assistant that you task things to when it's too dirty to do yourself. And they themselves then work through the whole society network to affect that statecraft aim. If you want to influence hearts and minds in a country, that means you work with the media. That means you work with the universities. That means you work with the local think tanks. That means you set up local NGOs. If there's a prosecutor who's giving you trouble, it means you work with the local judges, the local prosecutors associations, the local mayors and governors and presidents. But that requires you having an entanglement at every layer of society. The youth groups, the ethnic minority groups, the women and gender identity groups, the religious denominations. I mean, everyone right now can go to CIA World Factbook at cia.gov. Every country has the current updated CIA entry, whether you go to Bangladesh or Burma or Kenya or the UK, and you will see a meticulously documented demographic breakdown, the religious minorities, the percent of the population at varying age levels, what percentage of its workforce is unionized, what national resources it has, and all of these things are modes of soft power to accomplish a statecraft aim to advance U.S. national interests. And the thing that makes this all, I think, tough for a lot of people, and they take an attitude that comes across as conspiratorial, is because they have been under the presupposition that the world did not exist this way and has not existed this way for a full century now almost here in the U.S. They think that their universities are just, professors teaching students about a particular topic. They don't understand that, for example, that the Harvard endowment has made a huge amount of its $50 billion by working with the U.S. State Department in foreign regime change operations. I mean, this came out in the 1990s when Jeffrey Sachs was the head of the Harvard Endowment for International Development, was personally petitioning USAID for something like $500 million to administer the economic privatization of Russia during that shock therapy period. The Harvard Endowment and George Soros's Quantum Fund were given basically a no competitor closed auction bid on the on the sale of those formerly Soviet government-held assets. And Harvard is getting billions of dollars in grants in total from the U.S. government while they're doing favors for them. The same thing with Columbia University, the same thing with Stanford University. Americans think that the universities are something that they are, I don't want to say that they're not, but that they're only partially. It's the same thing with businesses and the business side of this. You know, there was a famous case in the 1970s where we overthrew the government of Chile, and it came out 30 years later, 35 years later, this was printed in The Guardian, that part of the reason behind that coup was because the Pepsi Cola company, its bottling operations were being threatened by Allende, and Pepsi reached out to Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State, to see what could be done to get rid of Allende. Kissinger then hooked up Don Kendall or Kendall Johnson, the chairman of Pepsi, with the CIA director. The CIA director and the head of the Pepsi Cola company had a personal meeting about how to mobilize a coup in Chile. They then had an additional meeting with the largest newspaper mogul in the country to assist in the CIA operation. And you drink Pepsi and you don't know how the bottling is made. You know, you go to the gas station, you pump your gas, and you think that the gas just comes out of the ground or it comes on a tree. You don't understand that a lot of ExxonMobil and Chevron only have the market dominance they have because the Pentagon has cleared the way for them to secure territory in Middle East, in Kuwait, in the Persian Gulf, in parts of Mexico. You don't understand that there's CIA activity and State Department diplomacy that's done as part of that statecraft. And so I think a lot of people are only now beginning to see the layers of that, and it causes a lot of shock mentally when they see that.
Sometimes in life, you just need a secret weapon. Maybe it's that one joke that always lands at the pub, or a dish you can whip up that makes you look like a Michelin-starred chef. Well, I've got both of those things in my back pocket, obviously. But my real secret weapon? It's Mack Weldon. Because when it comes to looking good without even trying, Mack Weldon has it sorted. Their timeless style, performance fabrics, and hidden details make every piece feel like it was designed to give you an edge, without making a fuss about it. I've been wearing their air knit underwear, and I have to say, they're ridiculously comfortable. I'm wearing it now. The fit is spot on, not too tight, not too loose, just effortless. And the best part, unlike other performance clothings that can look a bit, synthetic, Mack Weldon gear just looks like classic stylish clothes while feeling like the best kept comfort secret. If you want clothes that work as hard as you do without shouting about it, Mack Weldon is the way to go. Get timeless looks with modern comfort from Mack Weldon. Go to mackweldon.com and get 25% off your first order of $125 or more with promo code TRIGGER. That's MackWeldon.com, promo code TRIGGER. Do you think as well that we have been focusing in on America and talking about the way it's been conducting its operations and the corruption within, which of course exists, but at the same time, we kind of ignore, what the Iranians are doing as well, what the Russians are doing. Right. Everybody is playing this game. Right. So if the Americans weren't playing it, then the Russians would be. Right. And it's just a game, isn't it? It's an interconnected game.
It is. And in fact, that was actually one of the reasons it was set up in the first place. If you go back and you read The Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare by George Kennan, who was the head of the policy planning staff for the State Department in the 40s and 50s, he was the guy who would, weeks after he wrote this memo, would actually create this NSC 10-2 plausible deniability thing. And he wrote this memo a couple weeks before that cloak of plausible deniability was granted to the CIA. And he laid out that we need to do this dirty work of the inauguration of organized political warfare, that we need a formal political warfare capacity that is going to have to work with the criminal underworld. It's going to have to work with all the media outlets. It's going to have to work with the unions. It's going to have to set up all these front entities, and it's going to have to create informal channels for all this. And what he says is, if we don't do this, then the Bolsheviks will. And so we're going to, and he gives another example where he says the Brits have been doing this for, over a century. So basically, the Brits or the Bolsheviks are going to dominate the 20th century with their organized political warfare apparatus if the State Department doesn't have this, and if we don't create an intelligence capacity to execute that. And so I think that is true. And that's why I think what's happening right now to me is inspiring, because it's getting national consciousness to a level that's, I think, smarter than it was. And sometimes that veers you in stupid directions as you're trying to figure out how it all works. You see one thing and then you fixate on it and you think, okay, everything's this. You see another thing, you go, okay, no, actually that was wrong. It's this. You see another, okay, it's this. And then you go out in these directions and you sort of, but over time, it's just a network, and it's just how the world works. And that's not to excuse the immorality of organized crime or of intelligence gone wrong. There is the potential need for that dirty work to be done, if for no other reason than to combat the dirty work being done by other countries. But it can go rogue, it can go too wrong, it can go unaccounted for too long. And I think that is where we are, and that is why I think that it is so important that these disclosures come out to the maximum extent possible. And we went through this before and we lived. In 1975, during the Church Committee hearing, when the Democrats held a series of investigations and hearings into the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, and the IRS, you had a moment where the head of the CIA counterintelligence was holding up a heart attack gun about how we assassinate people with a gun that shoots a dart that makes it look like the person died of a heart attack. If we could survive that level of transparency, where we're literally showing our own assassination technique to how to kill someone and get away with it by making it look like they died of a heart attack, I think that you can do that today. And frankly, I think the disclosures that came out then is part of how the CIA survived at a time when it was under huge pressure from Democrats because of their work against the Democrat Party when it was against the Vietnam War, and it was the political warfare was being done domestically. So I think this is a healthy process. It's noisy and chaotic, and can result in some turbulence, but I think it's part of the cleaning house process. It's gone on too far, too long.
Well, you made the point, and I think it's a really valid point, which is that we might tolerate it. If you're an American citizen, you might tolerate it when it's against the Taliban or whoever. But the JFK and the Epstein things, as just two examples, those are things that involve U.S. citizens.
Right.
You've got an American president being assassinated.
Yeah.
And you've got this guy who was, up to God knows what. And the question with Epstein as well is, interestingly, is everyone thinks Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself. Do we know enough to actually say that categorically?
I don't think there's a question of how much smoke do you need to have before you just come out and say, there's a dang fire. I mean, you had the confluence of strange facts on the ground that are indisputable is something you seldom have in a case like this. You have both of the security cameras malfunctioning with none of the footage retainable. You have the pages in the visitor's log ripped out, and unrecoverable from who actually, visited the prison. You have both of the security guards falling asleep or walking off the job. You have the head of the Justice Department who's in charge of the FBI. The FBI is the intelligence arm of the Justice Department. And the person who's, would be prosecuting whoever killed Epstein if he died by homicide happened to be Bill Barr. Bill Barr's father, Donald Barr, was personally the math teacher, was the high school teacher of Jeffrey Epstein. You have the direct family connection between the head of the Justice Department and Epstein. Then you have the fact that Bill Barr started his career in the CIA. He told his high school guidance counselor he wanted to be the head of the CIA. He then worked immediately for the CIA for 7 years to start his career. He only became disenchanted with the CIA when the reforms were made in the late 1970s to fire 30% of the workforce after the Church Committee hearings. He went to night law school while he was working for the CIA. He then got his first legal job effectively while he was serving as the CIA's liaison to the Congressional Committee investigating Iran-Contra. If you can read this in the Washington Post and the New York Times, they describe Bill Barr in the early 1980s as the CIA's mop-up man, because he was the one who was the blocker and tackler to prevent CIA disclosures about the illegal activities of the Republican Reagan-Bush administration during Iran-Contra, the exact origin story for how Epstein even came into this world in the first place. And so the secrets of the Epstein universe, I think, are the secrets of the Bill Barr universe. And the fact that Bill Barr was the head of the Justice Department while all this happened, and it didn't even look like there was an attempt, frankly. I mean, if you go back, to those news cycles, the security cameras are gone. The visitors' logs are gone. The security guards fell asleep. And it was almost like jumping on the grenade immediately as it happened. And it's not the first time you have these strange things. I mean, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, fell off a yacht in 1991. I guess that's a suicide too. And then it comes out later that he was working, for Israeli intelligence at the time and potentially British intelligence, and had been known as this publisher. But then in death, we find out that there's this big intelligence network, and that happens to be a close partner of U.S. intelligence on many foreign policy issues. So the other thing is when you read CIA assassination guides, as I've done on my own streams, there's so much attention paid to trying to minimize and ensure that there's only a casual investigation afterwards, that you create the appearance of an accident. But you can't. To me, that level of evidence shifts the burden to where I think you need to presume that it is. But if there is evidence that absolves the Bill Barr Justice Department of that, I would be open to it. But I think that the burden has flipped where you need to presume suicide.
Mike, here's a question.
I'm sorry, homicide.
Homicide,
Yeah. I'm gonna. This is a very easy question. Why do you think that the Epstein files haven't been released?
I think for the same national security reason that we've been talking about, which is that whether it's U.S. intelligence, British intelligence, Israeli intelligence, whether it's implicating specific things about those networks or about the modalities through which those networks operate. So, for example, if those files show that Epstein belonged to intelligence and was reporting directly his conversations about the Iran deal, about his conversations with Ehud Barak to Bill Burns. I guess that was after it, but to the CIA director or to the Justice Department or to the FBI, you can imagine that straining relations between U.S. and Israel. If it comes out that there's a CIA memo that says, we know this about Epstein, he's doing this work for us, but he's also doing this work for the Brits or for the Israelis, you could see a situation where you might have delegations from those governments pushing on the State Department, pushing on the CIA, pushing on FBI, pushing on the Justice Department to not do that because it implicates their own national security. And this gets back to this sort of strange entanglement within the intelligence world where you have these intelligence coalitions. You have them in the Five Eyes. And so in theory, I mean, you can imagine a situation where, let's just say there's some joint intelligence work the U.S. is doing with New Zealand. And there's some common network that we're surveying. We have assets on the ground. Let's just say we're doing something in like Burma or Vietnam. Let's just say there's some network. We're trying to pry the Chinese influence off of Vietnam. And you've got these New Zealand contacts and we're sharing intelligence. And, in these intelligence, analyst memos or embassy cables, they talk openly about national secrets shared from the United States to the Five Eyes coalition. Mm-hmm. And then there's a movement within New Zealand to, some political party in New Zealand says the national security state has been oppressing us. And we think that they've been, politicized and are impacting domestic politics. We want all of these files about, their work within these regions to be public. Mm. You can imagine a State Department delegation saying, you better redact these documents. We told you these secrets in confidence. Mm. And so you could imagine diplomatic blowback. You could imagine, threats to the coalition. And so it's that layer of it, especially when you look at how deep the relationships go. Almost always U.S., UK, Israel, and potentially some other partner countries have moved together as a coalition bloc. For 80 years now, and it's almost always, even when it's not immediately a joint coalition, there's synchronization that's done to ensure that there's some compromised position that's happening on foreign policy, that's happening on Iran. That's now some of this fell apart under the Obama administration with the schism that opened up with Obama going through with the Iran deal against the protestations of Israel and against the protestations of Saudi Arabia, who's another close partner in this. And it's also, I should really add Saudi Arabia to this list because the Khashoggi network was working directly with the Epstein network. And Saudi Arabia is another one of these Middle Eastern countries who's closely aligned with U.S. foreign policy. Both Israel and Saudi Arabia, they really came together after decades of disputes and not, recognizing each other diplomatically and things, because they were both commonly threatened by the Obama-Iran deal. Mm. Trump gets in office and, eliminates that his first week. And then, Kushner and the White House end up, going through with the Abraham Accords and sort of trying to tie them together by economic development. But then they ran these operations against Trump, who was, and so you have this almost ancient relationship that only a decade ago started to develop its fissures. And then those fissures have been, widening and narrowing over the past 8 years through, the Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump thing. And I could see there being certain aspects that might be embarrassing that would be allowed because they embarrass one side of that aisle. It is, but I don't know how that'll play out because of the likely perception for the need to maintain the enthusiastic support of allies, during the Trump administration, or whether or not the Trump administration, Trump doesn't, if you're going to throw caution to the wind and say, I don't need to get reelected, we're also reorganizing everything with U.S. aid being reshuffled and, with what we're doing at the NGO layer, maybe it's time to renegotiate all of these relationships. And there's a chance that could happen with the UK. I know Trump has reiterated, the special relationship, but there's also a lot of conflict over what the Labor Party is doing on human rights grounds with free speech and the tension around Ukraine that is, could potentially lead to a rift there. But whatever happens with the files, I think is an interesting litmus test for how those relationships are going to go.
Well, Mike, it's been great having you on. Before we head to Substack, where our fans get to ask you their questions, the one we always end with is, what's the one thing we're not talking about that we should be?
Before Mike answers a final question, at the end of the interview, make sure to head over to our Substack. The link is in the description, where you'll be able to see this. Does Mike believe US State Department employees and employees in other federal agencies actively undermined Trump when he was running for president?
If you're in charge, what is the first best bang for your buck thing that you would go after? He's thinking about Doge in this case.
Yeah.
What is the most outstanding action that each of the Five Eyes country is taking that stifles or limits free speech or freedom of expression?
I think the role of unions in organized crime and statecraft, as we were discussing earlier, is something that has to be much more robustly explored. One of the main things that I think is likely to destabilize the U.S. In the next few years, as it was during Trump's first term, were these rent-a-riot, pop-up protests that can completely destabilize a country when all the workers are walking out, they're blocking the highways, they're provoking the police. So you're left with either a sort of authoritarian crackdown or, you know, your police precinct burns to the ground, as what happened in Minneapolis. But a lot of this is intermediated by the unions and these groups like AFL-CIO and SEIU and whatnot. And while there's been much attention by Doge on USAID and on the NGOs, I think there's this very unexplored layer which needs to be renegotiated, which is U.S. financial assistance to unions and worker groups internationally, with that money boomeranging back home to spill into, you know, paid protests. And so I think that's something that the Justice Department, the Department of Labor, and the State Department need to seriously reevaluate.
All right, head on over to Substack, where we ask Mike your questions. What countries around the world seem to have the purest form of government, or at least minimal influence from the blob, to what we call the deep state in the UK? Or similar style of corruption? Do any exist? Do any countries exist that don't have this?